All righty. We ready to go? All right. Um, all right. So last week, if you remember, um, we started chapter 2, and we covered something like the first 9 verses or so. Got through that, and the situation is that Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream. Whether he forgot it or he knows it, he asked his magicians to come in and give the interpretation of the dream, but uh, the wise men said, "Tell us the dream, we'll interpret it." They obviously had their methods of determining the meaning of dreams that they wrote in manuals and that kind of stuff. So they would look up the symbols and give them an interpretation, and just about anyone could do that. He kind of pulled a fast one on him. He says, "No, I'm not going to tell you the dream. You tell me the dream." And we really ended there. They went back and forth a couple of times, and we ended in verse 9. He says to his wise men, "Therefore," the last half of verse 9, "tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation." So he kind of turns the tables on his wise men a little bit. You kind of get the feeling that he's definitely in a mood to clean house. Whatever this dream was, it was very concerning to him. He needed to know the interpretation of it. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes. Perfect. And then there was light. There's a little bit later on here. Where does it say? He knows what's in the darkness and the light dwells in him. Okay, in verse 22. So I have a, real, illustration here. If I just don't knock it off of this table, that'd be great. So today we want to try to go ahead and cover 10 through 24. And then next week will be the last Sunday school class, I believe, for a couple of weeks for Christmas and New Year's, or fall on Sundays. And we're just having our worship service. So today is the 11th. 7 more is 18. Yeah. So next week will be our last class until after the new year. Okay. So here we are at verse 10. And let's go ahead and I'll do a real quick read through here to 24. The Chaldeans answered the king, "There's not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there's no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. And Daniel replied with discernment, or with discretion and discernment, to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, so they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king. Okay, that's what we'll try to get through here. There. So after Nebuchadnezzar kind of reveals what his plan is, you tell me the dream, and I'll know that you can interpret it. Okay, the Chaldeans really give up the ghost. Something awful right here. They make so many critical mistakes in what they say back to Nebuchadnezzar that they essentially prove themselves with what they say and what they're implying that they're just a bunch of tricksters, that they've got nothing to help with this interpretation and stuff. Okay. Notice that in verses 10 and 11, he says the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king." Okay. Now that is one of their first big errors. What are they actually saying here? Okay, there's not a man that could do what you've asked of us. And by kind of implication, they just admitted to the king, we can't do it. We can't do it. We can't do what you're asking us to do. We don't have that ability and that power, which is interesting because this was really the claim to fame for all of his wise men, all of his magicians. They're the ones that claimed that they had the ability through all of their knowledge and literature and secret arts and occult practices. They had the ability to communicate to the gods and find out what their will was for Nebuchadnezzar and all that kind of stuff. That's how they guided the kings of Babylon. That's how they guided Nebuchadnezzar's father and all of these things. So it's a huge admission that they don't have the ability to do what the king is asking. Okay, and then the admission that not only do they not have that power, but they also say nobody, no man on earth has that power. Okay, so these are the most powerful magicians and Chaldeans and stuff in the Babylonian Empire, probably in the known world. These are the best of the best serving in the king's court, and they're saying we don't have the power and the ability to do this. And they say, if there were someone else that were even more skilled than we are, they couldn't do it either. And so that's kind of, they're almost now in excuse mode. Okay, I put the kind of the illustration here. It'd be kind of like someone saying, well, I can't solve this physics problem, but neither can Einstein solve it. Okay, say, oh, I don't have those skills, but neither does Einstein. It's really a blatant admission that they don't have the skills, and they're trying to make an excuse, saying even if someone had much more skill than us, they couldn't do what you've asked either. Then to add insult to injury, they're going to make a third mistake here. They're actually going to claim to the king that he's being unreasonable in his request. Okay? He says, no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician or conjurers. I mean, they're almost blaming the king a little bit for this fiasco. They've got no ability to understand it, and they kind of turn it back around on the king and say, there's not a king alive anywhere that's asked anything like this. You're being completely unreasonable, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, given what we know about Nebuchadnezzar, he's a fairly, you know, you light a fire under him and he's going to go off. The number of people that he killed in creative ways, he's a, your typical despot. It probably wasn't the wisest thing for these wise men to tell the king that he's being unreasonable. It's almost, please, king, could you chop our heads off and tear us limb from limb? You're the one being unreasonable. It's not us. You're the one being unreasonable. Well, it certainly infuriated Nebuchadnezzar to no end here. So, but then they go on to say, and again, the admission is now starting to run a little bit deeper. It's not just they're admitting, that they don't have this ability and that kind of stuff like they've been claiming, for years and years in service to the Babylonian kings. But now they also proclaim that only gods could declare this to the king. Okay, and the irony there is interesting because these are the fellows that claim they can communicate with the gods with their incantations and all that kind of all of their knowledge. They're the ones that have been claiming this whole time, and now they kind of throw it on them. Well, only the gods could declare this mystery, to you, king. And it's interesting that why is it that the Babylonians and the different peoples in that day and age erected temples, especially in the Babylonian religion? Remember, they believed that the gods, dwelled and encompassed, inside the mountains, and they believed that the earth itself, they called that the mountain of the land, almost. I'm going to put a little further away here. They called that the mountain of the land, okay? And why did they erect the temples? The temples were attached to the earth, the ground, and so they believed that the gods, in that temple could be accessed because the temple, it was kind of erected as if it was a piece of the mountain attached to the land, and that's where they could go and communicate to their God. It was attached to the land. It was kind of erected looking like a mountain, and that was the place where they could go and communicate and offer worship to their gods. Okay, and again, that's why they built these temples. And now they're saying to the king, only the gods could tell you what this is. And still they're admitting, we don't communicate with the gods. Okay, we don't communicate with the gods. And he says that gods don't dwell with us as humans in the flesh. And again, that's why they erected the temples, so that they could communicate, so they could attach themselves and bond with the God there in a temple that was attached to the land. So pretty much their whole, charade of what they've been doing for years and years is laid to bear. Because it's interesting, everything that they said there is actually true. It's actually true. Okay, there wasn't a man on earth that could declare the matter, for the king. It is a difficult thing that the king is asked. Would take a god to declare it to the king, and gods don't dwell with human, flesh. Now, in our case, the one true God bends those rules a little bit. He certainly dwelled with us in the flesh. And he certainly is able to reveal dreams and stuff. All of that is true. But, the real highlight here is that these wise men, in so many ways, have admitted that they just don't have the power that they've been claiming that they had. They don't have it, okay? It really, it kind of reminds me of your modern day prophets and faith healers that you will see on YouTube and Christian television. Unfortunately, not Not a one of these prophets predicted COVID, nor did any of the faith healers go to the hospital and heal all these people of COVID. Okay, it showed. We've got modern day charlatans here that claim to have powers from God, but really don't. I think one of the most ironic things that I've ever seen in that word of faith, we call it that time, is do you remember Oral Roberts? Oral Roberts was a faith healer. Okay, he believed he had the gift of healing, and he he's documented to heal many folks, and I'll put that in quotes there. But what did Oral Roberts actually build in Utah? I think in Utah. He did build that, but there's something. Actually, it probably is in Oklahoma. I'm sorry, I'm getting the Mormon Church mixed up here. Oral Roberts, he built a hospital. Oral Roberts built a hospital. Okay, which is very interesting. Here's a faith healer. That wouldn't be the first thing that you would think a faith healer would build. A hospital. What do you do at a hospital? You treat sick people. What is a faith healer supposed to do? Treat sick people. Yeah, it never made sense to me. But anyway, point is, the wise men of Babylon didn't have the power that they have been claiming they had, and they de facto have admitted it here in the text. Okay, now I think Nebuchadnezzar, all of a sudden it hit him. Okay, these guys have been lying to me ever since I've been on it. They've been lying to my father. They're making this stuff up as they go. I think he just all of a sudden realized it. And in verse 12, it says, because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Okay, kill them all. Kill them all. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Okay, to kill them. Now, the only question is, was that command to kill the wise men in place, wherever they were? Go out, kill them, go to the next house, kill them, go to the next, kill them. It almost appears, because of what happens next, that they may not have been directed to kill the wise men in place, but it may have been round them all up, and we're going to do all of this publicly all at once, kind of as a testimony to the whole world that these guys are charlatans. So that command to kill them, I think, may have involved round them up first, we'll kill them soon all at once in a big public display so that everyone will fear, and that kind of stuff. That's at least a possibility. That would certainly be in line more with Nebuchadnezzar, what we know about his brutality in the way that he conquered certain nations. And that command to go round all these folks up went to a man named Arioch. Okay, so the next couple of verses here in 14 through 16, then Daniel replied with discretion to Arioch. So Arioch has made it to Daniel's house and his friends and get ready to round them up. Obviously didn't kill them in place. And because Daniel he certainly had time to ask a question, that kind of lends a little bit of credibility to the theory that maybe this guy's just rounding them up and they're going to execute them all at once, a little bit later. Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he should give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Now, in these 3 verses, we are missing just an unbelievable amount of conversation that's not put in the text. However, we do a little bit of creative hallucination and put ourselves in the seat, in that spot, we can at least figure out some things that would have had to have been part of those conversations. We don't know the details. The conversations weren't given to us, but there are some things that must have been mentioned for the events to transpire as they did in the text here in these 3 verses. Again, Daniel's allowed to ask the question, why is this thing so urgent? Okay, kind of gives credence that we're going to execute them all at once. Some, in the short time. Arioch is said in the NASB to be the king's bodyguard. However, that word that's translated bodyguard in the Aramaic, it means to slay. Okay, usually bodyguards, that's last resort to slay to protect the king. This seems to be the root meaning. So it's very likely that bodyguards here in this context were the king's executioners. Not just bodyguard. These were executioners that, that was their role in the king's court. And Arioch was the chief executioner. Okay? This would explain why Nebuchadnezzar put him in charge of rounding up all these wise men. Okay? Then Daniel asks a question. He says, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Okay, and that's in the NASB. And here, really, if you look at a plurality of translations, boy, you that word urgent and how it's translated across the different translations, that can lend a different flavor to the context of what's going on here. Okay, so the NASB translators, they chose to render the Aramaic word hasop here as urgent. Why is the king's decree urgent? What does it mean to be urgent? Usually, a very focused, speed with which to do this. Very focused. Okay. The King James Version uses the word hasty. Almost implies unfocused. Maybe, jump the gun kind of thing. We're going to do it quickly, but maybe Nebuchadnezzar jumped the gun a little bit. The temper got the best of him, so let's do it very hastily, that kind of stuff. But the NIV, I think, got it correct here. It renders the verb as harsh because the root word meaning of this verb here, or the adjective, is to show insolence. What does it mean to be insolent? It's to show just a rudeness or some harsh behavior out of disrespect. And certainly that was the context here, Nebuchadnezzar's stance towards the wise men. There was absolutely no respect at all. So I'm thinking that the NIV's got it right, that the translation in this context makes sense. Daniel asks, for what reason is the decree from the king so harsh? Why is it so harsh? Okay, and then obviously Arioch he at least respected Daniel enough, whether he knew Daniel or not, and we kind of get the feeling that he probably does know Daniel because he actually explained the situation to Daniel carefully. Now, here is where we have no knowledge of what that conversation was between Daniel and Arioch. Obviously, Daniel, he was very familiar with royal procedures. He couldn't just go walk into the king's palace and say, "Hold on, king," this kind of stuff. There were procedures and stuff. Given Nebuchadnezzar's mood at the time, Daniel may not have got a word out before somebody slayed him. Okay, so Daniel, he certainly went through Arioch to appeal to the king, and eventually he does that. Okay, but clearly Daniel had to explain to Arioch, and it had to be believable, that if the king gave Daniel some time, he could interpret the dream. That had to be part of the conversation, right? Had to be. He had to convince Arioch that given some time, he could do what the king, commanded. So whatever he said to Arioch, it had to be something that made the appeal. Yes, I can interpret the king's dream if you give me some time. Okay. Now, what's the downside of that? That's pretty much what the wise men were doing all along. Tell us the dream, give us some time, and we'll do that for you. Okay? So there was something more that Daniel really had to say to Arioch, because it sounded a little bit like the wise men, other than the fact that the wise men said, we can't do it, and Daniel certainly said, yes, I can do it. Other than that, the argument may have been similar, but there had to be something exceptional in what Daniel said to Arioch to, at that point, let Arioch take him before the king. It had to be something very persuasive, and we just don't know what that is. We know it had to be, I can interpret the dream, but other than that, we've got no knowledge of that conversation. Unfortunate. That would have been an interesting conversation to follow and stuff like that. Okay, so Daniel convinces Arioch here to take him to the king. And again, he goes before the king. And what verse are we in here? In verse 16, Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him more time. And again, there's a conversation between now Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar that we have no knowledge of either. It's not recorded. But Daniel had to say something to make Nebuchadnezzar believe that he could interpret the dream. And what that was, it may have just been as simple as give me 24 hours and we will interpret the dream. His wise men didn't say that. They said, we can't interpret the dream unless you tell us. At least Daniel said, I can do it, and just give me some time. Now, if we put ourselves in Nebuchadnezzar's shoes there, okay, what are we thinking? Possibly. All right. I heard that yesterday from the other wise men. A little different here, but bottom line is he's asking for more time. And I want to know the interpretation of this dream. I'm getting weary of waiting for it. Time's running out. He had to say something, to Nebuchadnezzar to convince him to give him more time. But I'm sure there was some skepticism. I mean, after all, the best of his wise men couldn't do anything. And here's this little, teenage Jewish boy that comes in and says he can do it. Okay, I'm sure it was met with some skepticism. Okay, some skepticism. Well, the king agreed to give him the time. Okay, doesn't actually say that, but obviously he was given the time. And in verses 17 and 18, he says, then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Okay? So, what's the first thing that Daniel does after the king gives him that time? he goes and tells his friends, and apparently they're going to have an all-night prayer meeting, prayer vigil. They're going to seek the Lord God for the answers here. It's interesting. They might request compassion from God so that Daniel and his friends wouldn't be destroyed with the rest of the wise men. Okay? Now, eventually, they do give the ask for the interpretation, but initially it was don't destroy us with the wise men. Perhaps they thought, spare us. If you're going to kill the wise men, at least spare us. So I mean, there's kind of a a plea for compassion for the Lord. And then eventually, we know what happens. The Lord does grant their request to reveal the contents of the dream. Okay. Now, I think that's fairly interesting. Just if we think about today's day and age, here are a couple of, we have a Jewish teenager and three of his friends, also Jewish teenagers. The first thing that they do when the crisis of, capital punishment imminent upon them is they pray and beseech and they seek the Lord. Okay, and for a group of teenagers to actually go and do that, especially boys, teenage boys, the three of them. That's and it's hard for us to, even when we read the text there, we think of Daniel as men and his friends as men doing something this responsible and this faithful before the Lord. Remember, these are teens, and we may not fully be able to grasp, the significance of that, because those of us that are parents, at least that have gone through that stage where our children were teenagers, this is not what teenagers do today at all, right? It's not. The teenagers, our teenage years are, filled with stupid mistakes, doing stupid things, saying things that we shouldn't say, and, occupying our time with useless pursuits. That's what teenagers do these days. Okay. Those of us that have gone through that point of life, this is a moment for self-reflection too. We were there when all this happened. So, think about that. How would you do it different if you had that to do all over again? Okay. How would we try to impart to our teenage children what Daniel and his friends actually did during a crisis? Is go right to the Lord for wisdom and all of that kind of stuff. So anyway, that part's for free. Won't charge you for that. So now, it's interesting. Remember, when Daniel's recording this, he's writing this in Aramaic. And so we're going to have some veiled references or, veiled theological teachings that Daniel is trying to instruct Babylonians about the truth of Yahweh, about God. And the first one here that he says is in verse 19, coming up here, is I'm sorry, I lost my place. No, he says the God of heaven in verse 18, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven. Now, why does Daniel use that term, God of heaven here? I think it's because he's trying to instruct the Babylonians that the God of heaven, whom he knows, is the one that actually is in control of the sun and the moon and the stars. And what was the tact of the Babylonians in their pagan understanding? They believed the position of those stars actually dictated, the fate of history and stuff. They were astrologers. They believed the motion of all of these things dictated, your fate and all of that kind of stuff. And I think Daniel spends a little bit of, ink in trying to put forth some theological truth, because the Babylonians may end up reading this in their own language. Remember, this is the portion that's in Aramaic. Okay, so there will be times where Daniel actually tries to instruct Babylonians on the truth of the Jewish God. Okay, Daniel and his friends ask God to reveal the mystery, and certainly the mystery in this context is the dream and its interpretation. The dream and its interpretation. Okay. All right. Any questions so far before we get into the next part? Comments? Okay. All right. Next couple verses. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to the men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Okay, the king's matter. Okay. Now, the text says that this mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So they're obviously holding a vigil, they're praying, and the mystery was revealed in a night vision. Okay, what's a night vision? Well, it's probably a vision that happened at night. Okay, it's probably not a huge revelation there, right? But what's a vision? Why is that specific to night? Well, a vision can be either received when the person is fully awake or fully asleep. And at least in this case, it appears that Daniel and his friends certainly were awake. I can't imagine a scenario where they would say, "Well, Lord probably will reveal to us the meaning of this in a dream. We'll have our prayer meeting, and then we'll all go to bed and wait for the dream to come and tell us what's happening." I think with the death penalty hanging over their heads, they probably didn't sleep a wink, and they were in prayer constantly, asking for what's going on. So it was, I'm thinking that Daniel had a night vision, that he was fully awake, and that certainly would be more, conducive to remembering the contents of it. If he was fully awake and had a vision, he was a lot more likely to remember it than if he was asleep and dreaming. Okay, I don't know about you, but I forget my dreams all the time, the details and stuff. So anyway, certainly would be a vision, and remember, this vision had to contain both the contents of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its interpretation. It had to be such that those two things were covered. So very likely this was a waking vision as they were praying. And then Daniel begins to offer a prayer of thanksgiving to the Lord, and this will be the last section that we can get to today. So he wishes to bless the Lord, and in verse Daniel, it says in verse 19, Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and the word here is the Aramaic barak, and in Hebrew, same pronunciation, probably different spelling. It's rendered here in ASB as bless rather than praise. Praise is the typical translation for that Aramaic word, that Daniel praised the God of heaven. That really is kind of the contents of everything he says after that. He's giving praise to God for a bunch of different things. His entire prayer is praise to God. He starts off, let the name of God be praised forever and ever. And of course, here, our Old Testament understanding of the name of God is equivalent to his person, God himself. Okay, when it says praise to the name of God, it's certainly means praise to God Himself, not just His name, but Himself. Because remember in the burning bush, His name was I am. I am. So His name and His personhood are related, and we praise His name. That's another way of saying we praise Him Himself. We praise His person Himself. Okay. So why are we to praise Him? He goes on and he lists a bunch of things that are causing Daniel to want to praise Him. He says, God is the source of wisdom and power. Okay, and what in this context, usually an Old Testament context of wisdom from Proverbs, has more to do with how you live your life, how you live your life. But here, wisdom is probably relates to the ability and the knowledge required to convey the dream to Daniel. He's saying God is the source of that wisdom required to do that. Okay, only God has the wisdom to tell Daniel the contents of the dream. The Babylonian wise men, they didn't have any wisdom with respect to this matter. Okay, he acknowledges God's power, and again, what comes next, not just his generic power to create the universe and that kind of stuff, power in this context and the surrounding thing when he talks about times and kings and all of that kind of stuff, is really power over the kingdoms and the kings of the earth, and that he's talking about here. God is in sovereign control over all of these kings and kingdoms and times and epochs that Daniel is mentioning here. It says in verse 20 that God alone can change the times and the epochs. Okay, and what are the times and the epochs? I think in our context here, it's likely that the times are referring to, like the span of time that these kings would rule in their part of the kingdoms. Okay, God is the one that decides what that time is, that this king will come on the scene and rule, that this kingdom will exist. And epochs could, very well mean the time of the rising and the falling of these kings. Okay, times and epochs. Okay, remember that God predicted about 100 years from when Daniel was alive that God was going to raise up the nation of Babylon to take the nation of Judah into exile. Okay, that was in Isaiah chapter 39. That was about 700 BC, about 100 years before these events took place. God predicted this would happen. He's certainly in charge of the times and the epochs. He knows it's going to happen before. Okay, he also revealed to Jeremiah that this exile would last 70 years. Okay, Jeremiah, that prophecy in Jeremiah 25, that would have been about 625. So about 10 or 15 years before, Nebuchadnezzar really came on the scene and started overthrowing countries, including Judah. Okay, and again, this is probably another veiled theological lesson to the Babylonians, because what was the Babylonians' view of all of these things? It was astrological, okay, that the motion of the stars and the planets were the things that determined personal and national destinies and all of that kind of stuff. So I think Daniel, in saying some of these things, that God is the one that appoints these times and epochs. He's really trying to teach the Babylonians, no, it's not the sun and the moon and the stars. It is the Lord God, the Almighty, that determines all of these things. Okay? Now, speaking of times and epochs, where recently have we heard those two things together? Acts, right? Acts chapter 1, the disciples. After 40 years of teaching in the kingdom, they asked Jesus what? Are you going to restore the kingdom now? And Jesus' response is, it is not for you to know the times or the epochs which the Father has determined by his own authority. Right? Same two Greek words. The Greek word, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Daniel chapter 2, same Greek words that Luke used in Acts 1, chapter 9. Okay, what were the epoch? What was the epoch that the age is another word for epoch. What's the age that the disciples were looking forward to? They were looking forward to the kingdom age, the messianic age. Okay, that rule. And God said that, Jesus said that that's God's prerogative, fixing those times and epochs. He gets to decide when that is. Okay, so Daniel is trying to instruct, I think, the Babylonians with that. Okay, the next phrase: He removes kings and establishes kings. Wow, that's almost like, here's the main punchline coming. Big foreshadowing. God is the one that establishes kings and kingdoms. What's the entire context and content of Nebuchadnezzar's dream going to pertain to? Kings and kingdoms in the future. Okay, Daniel is saying that he is the one that raises up and tears down kings and kingdoms. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar is about to find out that God raised him up, but also in chapter 4, he'll bring him down at just as quick. And so we're going to have a hard lesson, at least Nebuchadnezzar will, that God is the one that establishes kings and kingdoms. Now, I put a lengthy quote in here from a study guide. This is a secondary source. I do not have this study guide, but I pulled the quote out of someone that quoted it, that did have the study guide. So take it for what it's worth. This is a secondary source. I don't have this in my possession. But I like this quote. It says, the same point is repeated in the New Testament. What point? That God is the one in charge of rulers and authorities and kingdoms. In Romans 13:1, obviously, if God appoints kings and rulers, then kings and rulers are beholden to him for their position. Therefore, their position is a trust from God. Consequently, they should exercise this trust, recognizing God as their head. This is indeed how all rulers should perform, for they have in their hands the power to direct the course of the lives of God's special and beloved work, mankind. Clearly, this principle calls on every government to recognize God very specifically, and God is defined as the God revealed through Israel. A ruler's office is properly understood to be a divine trust, and it is to be exercised accordingly. Should he abuse this trust, then the inference is that God will intervene and depose his dynasty, or his rulership. The course of Babylonia's history during Daniel's life was to illustrate this principle. Now, what's the point? God's sovereign over the kingdoms of men. And you listen to this description of rulers, we don't have nothing like that today, at least in our country. We're not even close. I mean, every once in a while, we'll hear someone say something godly, It's usually a Republican, not a Democrat, okay, but immaterial. You know that a lot of these guys are not, or ladies are not in this for these purposes. They don't recognize this as a trust from God. They're not doing it as servants. Okay, the vast majority of them, even the ones that we like, are there serving themselves. And I'm pretty confident that out of all 535 plus 100, probably only need one hand to count how many actually believe what this guy just wrote about their sacred trust of being a ruler and authority. many of them would say that they believe in God and stuff, but how they rule would deny his existence. They need votes from people like us, so they'll throw us a bone occasionally or so. Okay, but these are all important things, and the whole point. And I think one of the main points and themes in Daniel is God is sovereign over the kings and nations and kingdoms that mankind in history has set up and stuff. Okay. Again, Daniel is now gonna say that he is the one in verse 22 that reveals profound and hidden things. He's the one that is the one that gives direct knowledge of all of these things, and it's really meant that the word profound and hidden is really implying that unless God intervened to tell the meaning, this is knowledge that humans or we or even Daniel and his friends have no ability to acquire at all. Okay, there would be no ability. Okay, what do we usually call that in the New Testament? We call that special revelation. It's not revelation that we could acquire on our own. God has to give us that revelation. Okay, who would ever thought that merely putting your faith and trust in Jesus as Lord was sufficient to secure our salvation? Man couldn't have invented that. All the things that man invents usually involves working hard and doing, religious and pious things. Okay? This was special revelation that we had to be given because we have no ability to determine that or come to that on our own. So this is the same kind of thing. These are unfathomable things that the Lord's hand needs to be in. Okay, I think of the casual phrase, someone tells you something and your response is, wow, I would have never guessed that. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here. In a million years, I would not have guessed what somebody just told me that, I had no knowledge of and couldn't come to that. Okay. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. In this context, it really's got to refer to God knowing what normally can't be known. Okay, God has the ability to know these things before they happen. Okay, he is certainly able to do that. And then Daniel kind of changes gears just a little bit. Okay, the first part of his prayer, he is acknowledging God, he's praising God, but here, starting in verse 23, he begins to address God personally. He switches from, thanking God and all that kind of stuff, describing what he is like and what his involvement was in this whole affair of revealing the dream to Daniel. Now he's directly addressing God, and he says, "Oh, you, God of my fathers, I give you thanks and praise. God of my fathers," obviously a reference to his heritage. He's certainly a son of Abraham, and he deserves all of the praise. Okay, let's quickly jump to verse 24. It says, "Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: Don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king." Okay. Now, again, Daniel had to say something fairly extraordinary, not just, "Hey, I know what the interpretation is." Okay. But I'm sure that he didn't tell him everything because that really was for the king. But he probably told him enough that Arioch said, "Okay, we need to get you to the king." And I think it's interesting. We're going to find that Arioch in verse 25, and we'll start there next week. he actually comes in and, says to the king, I have found a man. He's almost kind of trying to take a little credit. But think about it. He certainly would have been in a very precarious position because he's the one that brought Daniel to the king. Okay? What happens if Daniel couldn't do what the king wanted? So Arioch brought him in there. Probably Arioch was going to get, the slice head off too, or pulled limb from limb. Okay? So he had quite a bit to lose in this. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Arioch wasn't very far away from Daniel when they held his prayer meeting. It may have been that, because of that, you have all this information that went on. But notice, interesting, Daniel comes out of the prayer meeting, and the first thing he says to Arioch is do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Okay? That's kind of really a far-reaching thing. The first thing he said was not, yep, I got it. Interpretation given. Let's go see the king. Okay? Or, wait, don't kill me and my friends. He actually says, don't kill the wise men of Babylon. I mean, they were pagans. Okay? According to Old Testament law, they should have been killed for practicing, all of these things that the Mosaic law forbid. But Daniel says, hey, don't kill these people. He had a genuine concern for rank unbelievers, okay, that were involved in some of the worst occult practices that, the world has ever known. So that I think is kind of interesting. Daniel may have thought, put yourself in his position. He's writing all this down. Maybe some of these wise men would read the record of what was actually going to happen. Maybe they would believe after that. Who knows? But his initial appeal, don't kill the wise men of Babylon. Don't do this. And of course, that was Arioch's job. He it would have, befalled him to actually execute all these guys. And, even, most people wouldn't want that job for nothing. None of us would actually want that job. Okay, your job is to round all these people up and then kill them. Okay, I'm sure that wasn't Arioch's favorite part of his job, even though he may have been an executioner. So, again, certainly there was risk to Arioch, but whatever he said, whatever Daniel said to him, it convinced Arioch that okay, let's bring him before the king. Didn't tell him everything by presumption about the dream or its interpretation. That really was for Nebuchadnezzar. Because, again, God is the one that revealed this to Nebuchadnezzar through this dream. And he'll use Daniel to interpret it. But the focal point here is Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, God is revealing to him what will take place. Okay, so it's not likely that Daniel told Arioch everything, just enough to make him want to take him to the king. And Daniel closes with the words, "Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king." End of verse 24. So next week, we'll pick it up in verse 25. We have some interaction between, Arioch and Nebuchadnezzar, and then Daniel gets his chance to explain how it was that he came to understand the dream and its interpretation. He gives the king the dream. That's what I'm hoping to cover next week, up through verse 35, where Daniel actually describes the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And then first of the year, we'll get into the interpretation. That's going to take us some time. We also want to look at, remember back when we had the Maccabean thesis, that the book was written in 165-ish BC. We want to look at also what the Maccabean view believes about the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Lots of places to shoot holes in their interpretation, and we want to look at that and understand it. Both of those, the right interpretation and the Maccabean interpretation. We want to understand both of those very carefully, compare and contrast, so that we have confidence that the classic view of this is the correct one. Okay. Questions and comments. Welcome. We're starting to move along here in chapter 2. It's getting more exciting, I think, over time. And eventually next week we'll at least have the dream. And then early next year we'll get into the detailed of the interpretation. Lots of good information there. Thanks. Okay. Dismissed. The light is gone. Yes, I should not talk anymore now.